Welcome. This is part one of our four-part series on beer. In this one, we want to talk a little bit about the story and the history of beer. Without further ado, we'll jump right in. Definition of beer, I'm sure you guys can read this, but beer is different from other beverages in the fact that our source of fermentables, what the little yeast get to work on to make the alcohol in the beer, comes from grains. It's different from wine in that wine uses the juice and sugars, therefore, from fruits. Most notable is from the grape, but you do have other fruit wines. Finally, mead is a fermented beverage made by diluting honey with water and in some cases other fruit juices. For beer, our most notable grain is malted barley. Talk a little bit about malting in a few slides further down. Some of the history of brewing. It's been said that man's been making beer since the dawn of civilization. There's a good argument that civilization was caused by the fact that we figured out how to domesticate grains and brewing started. Cities started to spring up around those habitations. That's something for PBS to check out. Some of the history of beer, we have references as far back as 6,000 or more years in ancient Sumeria. There are references to beer process, etc. Other locations, and this you can see here, around the world where there were humans, they often figured out some sorts of fermented beverages. This slide shows a clay tablet from ancient Sumeria with some recipe for beer. It resembled some sort of kind of a soupy bread. Contained barley and emmer, which is kind of a precursor to our modern wheat. Also included spices and some fruits. Hops were not anything that was even utilized back in the very beginnings of beer. Hops are basically a very recent addition. In terms of brewing and that, why did this stuff happen? Is as its process, it creates a safe liquid. It's much safer than what could have been contaminated water, either contaminated pollutants, also contaminated with parasites, the single-celled organisms that could cause dysentery or other deleterious effects for folks. When you brew, you're adding heat in there for a while, and then the process of fermentation introduces alcohol, and also it lowers the pH, which gets rid of a lot of the pathogenic organisms. A little on the history of brewing. Talking about the introduction of hops. It wasn't until almost the 1500s that the hops became widely used. Before that, we had references to a lot of different plants, herbs, and spices being used. They kind of resemble some of the Harry Potter potion lists, but bog myrtle, yarrow, sweet gale, to name a few. Blends of these various spices and herbs and such were often a proprietary thing, usually controlled by some local authority. Most often that was the local church, and in some instances it was required by local law that you had to purchase your spice blend or gruits from that authority. In some cases, penalty of death for not doing so. It wasn't until 1516 that the Germans came in with the Reinheitsgebot, which was a purity law, mandating that all beer was water, barley, and hops, with only few exceptions. Just to put beer in perspective, the beer that most people know and think about today, the fizzy yellow stuff that comes in cans with Bud, Miller, or Coors in some form slashed across them, is the Pilsner style, which is a lager. Didn't really arrive on the scene until mid-1800s. Obviously, with the prevalence of those types of beers, you can see that those styles dominate the worldwide beer scene. We're working on changing that in the craft beer, but Again, important to note in terms of history. A couple other beer dates to note. Prohibition, beginning and end, 1919, 1933. Also notable for homebrewers, in 1978, Jimmy Carter was the president, signed a law legalizing homebrewing again in the U.S. after a notable almost 50-year period of illegality for homebrewing. A couple of charts here to finish this up, showing the explosive growth of craft brewing. You note there that the chart drops off in the 20s and 30s as a function of prohibition, when brewing itself, and in fact all alcohol was generally speaking illegal in the U.S. In the 40s, you had those breweries started up again. Those were large breweries, and they gradually dwindled through a period of consolidation and that. Finally, in the 80s, and some could be argued that it was the reinvention of the reintroduction of homebrewing that kind of gave craft beer its craft breweries and that its resurgence. And then you see that almost exponential growth that's going on, and you see us now with 24, almost 2,500 breweries here at 2013. Our next shows here in 2014 we're over 3,000 breweries. Saw a note the other day in something that it's finally the time we're actually getting back to the number of breweries in the country that were around in 1873. I think was the highest numbers. So it's taken us a while, but craft brewing is really exploding and coming into its own. Finally, where could we go from here in terms of beer? See that obviously craft beer is continuing to expand, as we saw from those last two slides. Some of that, brewers are kind of discovering and reinventing old styles of beer. Gruits that I spoke about, those non-hop type brews, are coming around. A few breweries are experimenting with those. New Belgium has one now available over at Haversham. I grew it. It's a blend. There is some hops in there as well, but there's bog myrtle, yarrow, and a number of other things in there. Gratzers have seemed to be kind of new on the scene in the last year or two. A smoked wheat beer. Grodziskie is another name for that. That's the named after the town where that beer style was last prevalent. Goes is a salty type of a wit beer. Westbrook Brewing up in Charleston has become real famous for that brew. The notable white can available over there at Haversham. Again, shameless plug for my employer. Finally, those brewers, they're discovering and trying new styles out, imperializing everything. So pushing the alcohol and flavor and taste to higher limits. You see, they're also doing on the flip side of that imperial, they're sessionizing everything. So taking what may be higher alcohol styles and bringing them down to a lower alcohol style, so that you can have a couple more of them before you get sleepy and have your last beer. Hybridizing styles by blending different styles together. Finally, who knows where those things are going to go. Last bit, we say that we're seeing the big names in brewing, the Anheuser-Busch, Miller, Coors, taking forays and jaunts into the craft brew scene. Blue Moon, Shock Top, Batch 19, Third Shift. Some of these boutique offerings from the big guys, where they're seeing that folks are thirsty for craft brew, for smaller, almost more intimate relationship with our brewers. We want to know where the beer is coming from. We want to know the process. We want to have these new flavors in that. So we're seeing the big names that are starting to experiment and come back in the craft beer scene.